Lutheran pastor in Houston by the name, his last name was Brown. And this pastor helped as much as he could, and his congregation helped as much as he could, the Wendish people. Now, all of these people didn't necessarily pay for their voyage to Texas. The wealthier people paid for a lot of the peoples who couldn't afford the voyage and wanted to come. It paid for the trip. So many of the people, when they got to Houston, were flat broke. At the time, the Wends did not know where they were going to go in Texas. Their idea was to have an area where they could practice their religion as they wanted to, speak their language, but where would this be? The Wends, who had come in 1853, had settled in New Ulm industry, the Frailsburg area that is between Houston and this area where we are now. So the people who could afford it loaded up their luggage and what have you and went as far as that. And from there, two men, a Mr. Doobie and a Mr. Lehman, who were probably the wealthiest of the group, were given the job of going and finding a piece of land that would be big enough that the people could settle on. In those days, they were told before they left Germany, be careful when you go to buy land, because the person who says, I own this piece and I will sell it to you, may not be the true owner of that piece of land. You have to be careful. So by 1854, the capital of Texas was located in Austin. Between Houston and Austin, there were no interstate highways, no US highways, but some way, Mr. Doobie and Mr. Lehman, with a young man who had come with the group who could speak English, found their way from Houston to Austin. And they did a lot of research in the land archives until they found a piece of land. They hadn't seen the piece of land, but they knew they could find the owner. And they asked him, would he be willing to sell this? And he would. It was the Delaplain League.
Absalom Delaplain was an Ohioan who moved with his family to Texas in 1835, arriving around the time of the Battle of Gonzales, and settling in Mina, today known as Bastrop. The day the Alamo fell, the news that 700 Mexican troops under General Antonio Gaona were advancing to Mina, burning everything in their path. Upon returning to a burned home, Absalom joined the revolutionary cause, where he served for at least 3 months and received the League of Land in return for his services. The newly formed Republic of Texas distributed over 1.3 million acres of land in this method to veterans of the fight.
And they paid, there's a little bit of argument, was it $1 an acre, was it 50 cents an acre? But at any rate, they bought the entire 4,000 plus acres for the Wendish people to settle on. Now, that didn't mean that they all came up here right away, because a lot of them had to find jobs in Houston to earn money before they could buy a piece of this land, because the 4,000 acres belonged to Mr. Doobie and Mr. Lehman. They didn't intend to keep it. They would sell it to the immigrants as they came up this way. So at first, there were very few immigrants on the 4,000 acres.
Upon arriving to the Delaplain League, Wendish settlers began to construct shelters, improve the land, and make it their own. Over that next year, they also attracted their nearby German neighbors, as Johann Kilian practiced Sorbish and German church services. Kilian's leadership, which resulted in bringing over the entire Wendish settlement to America, also brought this entire community of Germans and Wends together. But it were these distinct cultural and language differences which also drove them apart. All the meanwhile, a dedicated church was still something that was lacking in the new Serbin community.
By October of 1855, Pastor Kilian was living here with various families. He didn't have his own house to live, but they had promised him $1,000 a year plus a home, and he didn't have his home, and he sure didn't have his $1,000. And he told the group that if you don't build a house for me, I believe the people in Australia would like for me to come there and be their pastor. So they got busy and they built the log cabin, which is just to the south of this building. Eventually it turned into 2 rooms with a dog trot in between the 2 rooms. But that was not only the house for Pastor Killian, it was the church where the few people on the 4,000 acres would gather on Sunday. It was also the school where the children came during the week for the pastor to teach. By 1859, more of the immigrants had bought land on the Delaplain League and were living here, and the church log cabin was too small. So in 1859, they decided to build the second church, which was just to the north of the church that we're in now. It was a wood frame building.